colonization, which is a war crime, to which no one is yet to be prosecuted. There is a need for these war crimes to be referred to the ICC. What is the United Nations rather doing about this situation? The watchdog for human rights violations, at the realm of it, are 3 countries that are the biggest perpetrators of human rights violations in the history of mankind. And by that, I'm referring to slavery. All other nations, all other races that have been wronged, the Japanese, the American Indians, the Jews, you name it, they have been compensated. Reparations have been paid, and yet the biggest crime ever committed on any group of people through slavery, the people have never been compensated. The issue of reparations is way past due. One then looks back and says, as a people, why is it that we have failed to push back against these blatant abuses? Some of the most egregious ones, for example, the European nations that continue to refuse to retain the remains of our ancestors because they were classified as trophies of conquest. To this very day, evidence of murder, they refuse to return the remains of our ancestors for proper burial, just to give them simple human decency. United Nations sits back and watch this, and they say nothing. The artifacts, priceless artifacts which were stolen out of Africa, they don't deny it. Oh yes, we stole them, but we're not returning them. They're nicely displayed in their museums throughout Europe. Some are still in basements, not yet displayed. They simply refuse to give them up. Where else could this level of abuse occur except in Africa? Where else could the people also collectively fail to demand that what is right be done? It's because they defeated us where it matters the most, the mind. The mind is where they defeated us, where we have this inherent fear of those who don't look like us. My brothers and sisters, how long are we going to continue to allow those from the West, and now joined by those from the East, to continue to abuse us, to continue to exploit us? You see, you got to remember, when they invaded Africa, they invaded us as a continent. When they enslaved us as Africans. When they colonized us as Africans. When they exploit us as the continent, as individual countries. You take it to the next level. When we were taken away to the faraway lands as slaves, they enslaved us as Black people. Even within the plantations, they divided us. They continued to use the rule of divide and conquer, and still they succeed at keeping us where they want us to be through using us as groups, putting systems in place as groups. Therefore, it only makes sense that if we are to undo what they are doing, we can only succeed if we also push back as groups. Small groups, if you are in a school situation, be it a university, come together as Black students and fight your issues together, united. At the workplace, a group of Black people, come together, fight for your issues, for your rights, united. As countries, come together, fight as a country and push back. As regions, be it the Caribbean, South America, in Africa, come together and fight these wars at every level as groups of us Black people. That is how they defeated us. That is how we are going to defeat them. I'm talking about unity of purpose. This moment, my brothers and sisters, is calling for unity of purpose. The abuse of Black people around the world has got to come to an end. We can no longer continue to accept the status they put us in to be the world working class to perpetuity. I refuse to accept that. As a Black woman, I refuse that. As a mother, as a grandmother, I refuse to leave this world the way it is for my children, grandchildren, and generations to come. Something must be done. And it starts with you taking that ownership, taking that responsibility to wake each other up, to educate ourselves, to understand the genesis of why we are where we are as a people. We must come together just like other races have done. Unity of purpose is what this moment is calling for. So as we reflect and celebrate Africa Day, let's make our ancestors proud. Let's pick up where they left when they fought the wars of resistance and resisted occupation, but lost because they were using bows and arrows. We have a responsibility to pick up where they left. We are the ones who brought humans into this world. The tallest pedestal belongs to us. We have given it up. It is time for us to reclaim it. Justice for all. We must come together and demand a world that is free of racism, bigotry, and hate. We must demand a world that is righteous, free, and fair. So as a united African people, we're calling upon all righteous, peace-loving members of our beautiful earth to simply demand a better world. And once again, a world that is free of racism, a world that is free of bigotry, and a world that is free of hate.
So, today we want us to discuss about a video that was done by Dr. Arikana Kwao. I think she did this video while she was still the ambassador of USA, of African Union to the USA. She was holding such an important position to the Africans, you know. Now in this particular video, Dr. Arikana Kwao is going to discuss the consequences of division in African states, the implication of slavery and modern imperialism, which is a reflection of her thoughts and this specific speech. Now, one of the things we'll have to discuss would be the impact of colonialism on African states, consequences of the scramble for Africa, the legacy of slavery in Africa, economic disparities and underdevelopment, psychological trauma and social struggles, continued exploitation and systemic injustices. There is so much that the doctor is going to reveal to us. So without further ado, I want us to jump into this speech, watch it, and then I'll give you my critical analysis by the end of the video. Let's dive in.
Let's reflect on what our Pan-African fathers wanted to accomplish when they met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, back in 1963. They met to discuss the possibility of an Africa that was united, an Africa that spoke with one voice, an Africa that could only defeat colonization, an Africa that could only succeed at accomplishing and winning true economic liberation through unity. Through unity, meaningful unity of purpose. Sadly, when they went to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1963, they were divided. We had the Casablanca group, who were Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, who said Africa for the Africans and African unity now. Sadly, they were not the majority. The others, who were the Monrovia group, They said, let's hold off on this unity thing. Let's go slow. My fellow brothers and sisters, Africa lost when the Casablanca group lost in 1963. They came out with a compromise agreement, which was the Organization of African Unity, which has since been renamed African Union. Since 1963, we have been going slow, which were the wishes of the Monrovia Group. The only issue we've been able to accomplish since 1963 was the creation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is now seeing Africa going to the world stage as one customs union. The other wishes, which were the establishment of an African military, the establishment of a single currency, a single monetary policy, a single stock exchange, we have not been able to accomplish any of those building blocks for economic development. Let me remind you that at independence, African countries were given limited and what I say in some cases, fake independence. But what was denied Africans was true economic liberation, because they understood in order for the Western world to continue to exploit Africa, economic liberation was to be denied Africans by any means necessary. Let me take you back in history, when the Africans were minding their own business and the invaders from the West descended upon them. They descended upon them and put in systems to see to it that Africa and her children were forever defeated and dominated, starting with slavery, then colonization, then the Berlin Conference, where they met for 4 months to come up with a policy on how to see to it that Africa and her children are forever defeated and dominated. The policies they put in place back in 1884 remain alive and well in Africa today. Those policies continue to wreak havoc in Africa today. For those of you who say, oh, Berlin Conference is a thing of the past, think again. As long as we have a country called Eswatini, as long as we have a country called Togo, as long as we have a country called Malawi, even the big ones, Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, on their own, they simply cannot survive. And yet, the division of Africa was intentional, was deliberate, and was supposed to have specific desired outcomes. And those outcomes continue to be felt to this very day. They did not end there. When the children of Africa were taken to the Americas as slaves, what they were subjected to on slave plantations, following the quote-unquote freedom of the slaves, they followed up with Jim Crow. They followed up with redlining. They followed up with systematic imprisonment of Black people. They followed up with continued abuse and denial of economic advancement of Black people, no matter where you find us. Whether you find us in the Americas, whether you find us in the Caribbean, in South America, in Europe, and of course back in Africa. We are the working class, systematically relegated to be forever the working class. Back in Africa, in spite of having been given independence, the invisible hand remains alive and well. No matter how hard African countries try, yes, we have our own responsibilities to shoulder. But the bottom line is, after slavery, after colonization, after the Berlin Conference, then came the world geopolitics that set out to have systems in place that will see to it that forever people of African descent will never attain true economic liberation. I'm talking about the world financial systems, World Bank, IMF, the Bretton Woods institutions. I'm talking about the World Trade Organization, which has blatantly ignored abuses of Africa because it was created and understood that Africa will forever be providing raw materials to the Western countries to the detriment of the Africans. I'm talking about the World Health Organization, which, as you saw during COVID, Africa was left hanging. I'm talking about the United Nations, an entity that is supposed to be the watchdog for human rights around the world. The 3 members of the 5-member UN Security Council are some of the biggest abusers of human rights through slavery. Slavery, which is yet another war crime that no one is yet to be prosecuted.
So, after watching this specific video, here is my analysis from the speech that was given by Dr. Arikana Chihombori Kwao. The first thing we need to discuss is this. Dr. Arikana Chihombori Kwao's perspective on the consequences of division in African states, the implication of slavery and modern imperialism, is informed by her experience as a Pan-Africanist and an advocate for African unity and empowerment. She highlights the importance of reclaiming African agency and sovereignty in the face of external pressure and historical injustices. Now, Dr. Arikana Chihombori Kwao was emphasizing the need for Pan-African solidarity and unity to overcome the legacies of colonialism and slavery. She calls for African countries to prioritize intra-African trade and cooperation. She was also telling us to reject foreign intervention that undermines sovereignty and promote a shared vision of African development and prosperity. Now, Dr. Arikana Chihombori, this speech, she was serving as a call to action for African leaders, policy makers, and citizens to mobilize against the forces of oppression and exploitation. She urges Africans to reclaim their history, culture, and resources, and to work towards a future of self-reliance, dignity, and prosperity. By standing in solidarity and reclaiming their agency, Africans can chart a course towards true independence and liberation. From her speech, she was able to tell a lot of things about the slavery that, modern day slavery, which has been going on in the French colonies in West Africa. The other day, the president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore, was able to give a thorough warning to those slave owners who are there in the Burkina Faso countries. You know, French has had a huge influence on these people. Now, another thing that I discovered from this speech that was given by Dr. Arikana Chihombori Kwao is this. Colonial powers have carved up Africa in the 19th century. During the 19th century, they have disregarded pre-existing ethnic, cultural, and territorial boundaries. This arbitrary division has resulted in the amalgamation of disparate ethnic groups and cultures into artificial nation states. Forgive my English, but take the message. The imposition of foreign rule disrupted traditional governance structures and undermined indigenous system of authority, leading to social upheaval and political instability. They never respected our predetermined, pre-established cultures, our history, and our territorial boundaries that we placed. They disregarded that at all. Maybe we would have had just 5 regions in Africa, but they came, now we have 55 countries in Africa, you know, because of the colonial rule. Now, we can't analyze this speech without underlooking the consequences of the Berlin Conference, which is also the consequence for the scramble of Africa. The scramble of Africa had profound consequences for the continent during the exploitation of natural resources, forced labor, and the suppression of local economies. European powers extracted wealth from Africa while neglecting to invest in the infrastructure or human capital development. The exploitation entrenched poverty and underdevelopment in many African countries, perpetuating a cycle of dependency and marginalization. Now, the legacy of slavery in Africa and how it's affecting modern-day Africa and African descendants. The transatlantic slave trade devastated African societies, leading to the forced displacement of millions of people and the disruption of familial and social structures. The legacy of slavery continues to reverberate in modern Africa, manifested in economic disparities and social inequalities and systemic racism. Moreover, the loss of human capital and cultural heritage has hindered the continent's development of perpetuated cycles of poverty and marginalization. Now, division of African states. Another thing which the professor, the doctor, she's a medical doctor, highly emphasized was the division of African states, which I've touched some of it with the scramble of Africa, you know. Now, the arbitrary borders which were drawn by colonial powers divided ethnic groups and cultures, often pitting them against each other in conflicts over resources, territory, and political power. The legacy of division has fueled ethnic tension and civil wars, hindering efforts towards national unity and socio-economic development, you know. Another thing is the legacy of colonialism and the artificial nature of many African states have contributed to persistent political instability and governance challenge, and governance, which is now a challenge in Africa. Governance is a huge challenge in many African countries. We are now waking up to new leaders who are promising a better Africa for the Africans. We can't forget the new president of Senegal, Diomaye. He's really doing a nice work with the speech he gave out, you know. Now, the legacy of colonialism and the artificial nature of many African states have contributed to persistent political instability and governance challenges. Weak institutions, corruption, and authoritarian regimes have undermined democracy and hindered sustainable development efforts. Moreover, the lack of cohesive national identities have hindered efforts to address common challenges and pursue collective goals. The imposition of colonial rule has disrupted social structures, traditional ones, you know, and undermined cultural identities, leading to a loss of cohesion and solidarity within African countries. Moreover, the legacy of colonialism continues to shape perception of identity and belonging in Africa, often exacerbating divisions along ethnic, linguistic, and religious lines. Reclaiming and celebrating African heritage and cultural traditions are essential steps towards fostering unity and resilience in the face of external pressures. This is very, very powerful, the speech she gave, you know. I had to delve so much into my research to realize how impactful it is, you know. Economic disparities and underdevelopment Africans are facing because of the division and because of the colonialism and the slavery. Now, the transatlantic trade can never be overlooked. The transatlantic trade have decimated African societies and economies, leading to the loss of millions of lives and the disruption of traditional economic systems. The exploitation of African labor and resources enriched European powers at the expense of African development, perpetuating cycles of poverty and underdevelopment that persist to this day. The legacy of slavery continues to manifest in economic disparities, with African countries facing systemic barriers to growth and prosperity. There is also a trauma that it has left on Africans, not only Africans, but all the descendants of Africa. The trauma of slavery continues to haunt African communities, manifesting in psychological scars, intergenerational trauma, and social struggles. The legacy of slavery is evident in the persistence of racial discrimination, social inequalities, and marginalization experienced by people of African descent worldwide. Healing the wounds of slavery requires acknowledging and confronting the legacies of oppression and injustices, promoting dialogue, reconciliation, and social justice. You know, despite the abolition of slavery back in the days, the exploitation of African labor by the West and by other people continues through neocolonial economic structures and global power dynamics. Western powers and multinational cooperation continue to extract wealth from Africa, perpetuating cycles of dependency and underdevelopment. Addressing the legacies of slavery requires challenging systemic injustices, promoting economic empowerment, and advocating for a reparative justice to redress historical wrongs. You know? And then another thing which I noted from the speech was this: economic exploitation and dependency. Western imperialism has evolved in the modern era through economic dominance and exploitation. African countries remain economically dependent on Western markets and financial institutions, perpetuating a cycle of dependency and underdevelopment. Structural adjustment programs imposed by international financial institutions have further exacerbated poverty and inequality, prioritizing debt repayment over social development and economic growth. We've seen this happening, and it's true. Africans, when they borrow loan from the World Bank, they pay a huge interest, while the Western powers, when they borrow loan from the World Bank, they pay less to nothing interest. Who should even be paying interest? The person who has the capabilities, not the person who does not have the capabilities, which is so much evident. This is the world we are living in, you know. Now, Western powers continue to exert political influence in African countries through covert operations, military intervention, and support for authoritarian regimes. The legacy of colonialism is evident in ongoing conflicts and instability fueled by foreign interest and geopolitical rivalries. Neocolonialism perpetuates a cycle of dependency and undermines African sovereignty, hindering efforts towards self-determination and regional integration. Now, Western cultural imperative is pervasive in the era of globalization, shaping norms, values, and lifestyle worldwide. The dominance of Western media technology and consumer culture marginalizes indigenous knowledge systems and cultural traditions of Africans. It's also eroding our cultural diversity and identity as Africans and people of African ancestry. Addressing cultural imperialism requires promoting cultural exchange, revitalizing indigenous language and traditions, and challenging Eurocentric narratives of progress and development. You know, that is what the former ambassador of African Union to the US, Dr. Arikana Chiyombori, said about the situation of Africans and the situation of imperialism that we continue to suffer today, we Africans, as a problem. You as an African American, you as an African diaspora, what do you have to say about this? Share your thoughts on the comment section. Tell me what you think, and then we shall have a discussion. Thank you for watching. Support the channel on Patreon, and remember to give me a thumbs up. Yeah. See you in the next one. Stay African.